Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming out this afternoon. My name's Dan Inkster. I'm the director of the Elizabeth D. Rockwell Center on Ethics and Leadership at the Hobby School of Public Affairs. And I would like to welcome you to the 10th annual Richard Gelwick Endowed Lecture. I'm pleased to say we have in the audience with us today Alan Gelwick, Richard Gelwick's son, and someone with whom I've worked closely over the years, choosing the speakers for this series and organizing this series. So. And I'm sure Alan joins me in shaking his head at the fact that this is a 10th annual Gelwick Lecture. I can't believe it. I came here, I started at UH, I think during the third year. So the lecture has grown wonderfully, and we've had an incredible lineup of speakers, and that tradition will continue today. Richard Gelwick, the namesake of this lecture, was an educator, theologian, and justice crusader. During the 1960s, he was the campus minister at the University of California, Berkeley, where he worked closely with anti-war protesters and the free speech movement. Later, he joined the religion and philosophy departments at Chapman College and Stevens College, and he closed out his professional career as professor and chair of medical humanities at the College of Osteopathic Medicine at the University of New England. Throughout his life, Dr. Gelwick was a tireless advocate for gender and racial justice in higher education and society. His scholarly interests focused on the connection between science and faith, and he published two well-regarded books on the topic, exploring the philosophy of Michael Polanyi. Toward the end of his life, in an essay entitled The Importance of Ethics in Public Policy, which provides the mission statement for this endowed lecture, Dr. Gelwick wrote, "The perennial problem of human society is the translation of love into justice in the domain of common life. Discerning how to translate love into justice and mercy in the complex modern world is a fundamental issue which deserves more scrutiny than it currently receives in the contemporary university." Today we honor Dr. Gelwick's life and work by contemplating what values like love, justice, and mercy might look like when applied to public policy, and specifically today to the world of work. And we couldn't ask for a better speaker to talk on this topic. Wait, I've got more to say. Got to build her up a little bit more. Elizabeth Anderson is the Arthur F. Thurnow Professor, John Dewey Distinguished University Professor of Philosophy and Women's and Gender Studies, and Max Shea Professor of Public Philosophy at the University of Michigan. She was named one of the world's top 50 thinkers by Prospect Magazine in 2020, was awarded a prestigious MacArthur Genius Award in 2019, and was profiled in The New Yorker in 2018 as the philosopher redefining equality. Her recent books include Hijacked, How Neoliberalism Turned the Work Ethic Against Workers and How Workers Can Take It Back, and Private Government, How Employers Rule Our Lives and Why We Don't Talk About It. Earlier books include the prize-winning Imperative of Integration and Value in Ethics and Economics. She's also written numerous articles on value theory, the ethical limitations of markets, facts and values in social scientific research, feminist and social epistemology, racial integration, affirmative action, democratic theory, egalitarianism, and many other topics. She's a prolific author whose interests range widely. There's so much on Professor Anderson's CV to try to summarize that I really can't do it justice. So let me just say, pretty big deal in the world of political philosophy, who's had a huge impact on contemporary thinking about social justice in several different areas. Professor Anderson will talk today for about 45 minutes, and then she'll be happy to take your questions. We're very pleased that she accepted our invitation to give this year's Gelwick Lecture, so please join me now in welcoming Professor Anderson.
I just want to say it's a tremendous pleasure to be able to address you today and to come here in the beautiful city of Houston. It's my first time here. I left Detroit last night under snowy conditions and have arrived here in a beautiful springtime and had a lovely walk around the campus. It's quite glorious. Thank you so much for inviting me. Today I'm going to be talking about the work ethic and the post-work ethic, two ideas that I've been thinking about a lot lately. I'm going to start with famous economist John Maynard Keynes, who wrote in 1930 a very interesting little essay called Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren. He defined the economic problem that we had to solve as the satisfaction of our basic needs. And he predicted that 100 years hence, productivity growth will have solved this problem such that we could produce what we need with a fraction of the labor that was used in 1940, that was required in 1930. And indeed, his prediction, he's a good economist. His prediction really panned out for the industrialized countries. So here you could see average national income on the left between 1929 and 2023. Not quite 2030, but already you see average national income in the UK is increased by 4, and in the US by 5.6. So he's pretty much right on the dot in terms of productivity growth. And then most of the essay is dedicated to the question of, well, what will we do once we solve the economic problem? Once we could actually satisfy all of our fundamental needs with a fraction of the labor hours that was needed in 1930. And he said our fundamental choice lies between continuing the practice of the work ethic and what would we do with the additional work hours that weren't needed to survive? Well, we would, compete with each other to consume luxuries and work harder so that we could, do better than our neighbors. That's how he understood the work ethic. On the other hand, what he recommended was the leisure ethic. So he thought what we should do rather is we'll share around all the socially necessary labor, and then we really only have to work about 15 hours a week, and the rest would be leisure time. And then we could spend our time on intrinsically valued activities, in contrast with work, which is purely instrumental. Just, you do it in order to get money so that you can consume. Keynes predicted that we'll come to realize once we're in such a wealthy state that the love of money is a disgusting morbidity, a semi-pathological propensity, and we'll come to our senses and choose leisure and pleasure, or as he said, we'll prefer the good over the useful. Now, this is a beautiful picture in the Detroit Institute of Arts. It's one of the most popular paintings that people crowd around to see. It's Millet's Leisure Hours, and you see these beautiful girls dressed in their finery. They're obviously quite wealthy, and they're quite beautiful girls. But you can see here that they are also pretty bored, and they can't really play in those fancy frocks. And indeed, I'm sure their parents were probably yelling at them if they did start prancing around because it could get their frocks dirty. And you could see exactly Millet's attitude towards this rich people's lifestyle, because those fish in the fishbowl mirror the girls. They're just trapped in this little world, and all they can do is just circle around this tiny little room, right? And they're just as bored as those goldfish are. Now, Keynes knew rich people. He hung around them. He himself was actually rather wealthy. He knew what they were like. He was English, knew the English upper class. And he acknowledged that the idle rich had not really figured out in his day how to lead good lives. he knew this. He saw them up close and personal, right? But he says, eventually we'll figure it out, how to actually engage and how to practice the arts of life. He was confident we'd be able to solve this problem. Now, what happened, though? I want to suggest that Keynes made a quasi-failed prediction. So here you could see annual working hours per worker. And you can see from 1870 to 2017, and you can see they have been going down, so that's consistent with his prediction. However, they haven't gone down to 15 hours a week by any means. The United States is pretty much on top here. We have much more of the work ethic. You might be surprised that the bottom country graphed here is Germany. But yeah, they are the masters of leisure time among the countries selected here. I've talked to some Danes. Danes get 7 weeks of paid vacation when you throw in the holidays. Imagine that, almost 2 months off paid vacation. That's almost unimaginable for American workers who are not guaranteed by the state even a single day of paid vacation. Whatever vacation we get that's paid is only by contract with our employers. And if you study who gets that, only about half of American workers get any paid vacation by their contract. And most of those workers do not take all of the vacation days that they're entitled to. Okay? That's why the United States is on top of this graph. So people are working between 26 and 34 hours a week, about twice as much as Keynes thought would be optimal. And, why is that, and what should we think about that? Well, there remain today people who are following Keynes in holding that we should really endorse the post-work ethic, just as Keynes did. So here's Philippe van Parijs. He's a Belgian philosopher, and he wrote a very famous article in a philosophy journal called Why Surfers Should Be Fed, in which he argued that everyone, without exception, should just get a monthly payout, a universal basic income, and at the maximum feasible level for the society, and that people should be entitled to spend the time thereby liberated however they like, even if they're just surfers and just want to play around for the rest of their lives. Okay? So his argument for this was based on a conception of freedom, which he calls real freedom. Real freedom is when you really literally have all your options, you're not doing anything out of necessity, and that's what we should be maximizing. Choices that are not driven by sheer necessity, okay? And he had several arguments against the idea that we have any duty to work at all. Since then, the tech people in Silicon Valley have been advocating a universal basic income, some of them, but for rather different reasons. So here we see Andrew Yang. What he anticipated was that Silicon Valley technology, AI, and so forth, would render most of us unemployed. Like our jobs will just be going away. And so, well, you can't really lead people to starve. So all of the 100 billionaires who are minted in Silicon Valley would have to shell out to support the rest of us on a universal basic income, okay? And indeed, we are seeing the replacement, even in the services in some professions. AI is taking some of the tasks there, and even creative work. Now we have AI making novels and even movies. Maybe those screenwriters will be out of business. Actors, it's easy to simulate them. And so the UBI is going to be a solution to all that. But is the work ethic really obsolete? Well, my latest book, Hijacked, How Neoliberalism Turned the Work Ethic Against Workers and How Workers Can Take It Back, part of my narrative does discuss the version of the work ethic that Keynes condemned. And that is what turned into neoliberalism today, I argue, in Hijacked. And that was Keynes's idea, right? Just endless drudgery, work that has no intrinsic value or meaning for workers, all just to maximize profits for the rentier class. And indeed, that version of the work ethic is a real version of the work ethic. It was invented by capitalists in the late 18th century. But I went back and read the original Puritans, okay? And the peak of the Puritan work ethic was developed in the 17th century. You have 16th century theologians too who are working on the work ethic and developing it, but it really reached its peak in the 17th century. And these are amazingly revelatory theologians. And so you would get leisure, but not in the context of a post-work ethic. And that's essentially what the social democracies do. Everyone is expected to work, and all the social democracies have very high rates of labor force participation. You work hard, you pay pretty high marginal taxes, but then the taxes come back to you in the form of various benefits, including benefits that enable you, say, to take off paid time for work when you have a baby, right? And men and women alike have guaranteed paid parental leave that's pretty generous in these countries because the work of integrating a newborn into family life is itself very important work and necessary for child development. So they're working too, even when they're not doing paid work. And that's what we mean by decommodified labor. People are still doing socially necessary work, even if it's not like earning a wage on the market. It's still socially necessary, and so it's getting paid through a paid parental leave system. So what is that work like? Well, here is Robert Sanderson, who wrote a wonderful sermon called Ad Populum. And the Puritans believed that God has called each of us to a specific calling, a specialized occupation in the division of labor. And in this essay, in this sermon, he also articulates a vision of justice as reciprocity, okay? And he compares the division of labor to all the gears interlocking and meshed together to tell time. And the division of labor is like that. So he says, as in the artificial body of a clock, one wheel moveth another, and each part giveth and receiveth help to and from others, so should it be in the civil body of the state, right? The picture here is just like the little gears of the clock are helping each other along and move along to tell time. Each of us in the division of labor is playing our role to help each other satisfy our needs. We both give and receive help to each other, and that's what the division of labor is all about. Everybody needs help, and everybody who's able to provide help should do their share of helping, just like those little gears in the clock. They're doing their part to tell time. So here what you get is a class-neutral ethic, right? No class of people is entitled to be idle. Every class of people needs to be helping as well as receiving help. This was very much an argument against the idle rich, the landlords of England, okay, is who he's addressing, who are just taking rents but not really giving much back to society. And this, I think, grounds an objection to universal basic income. How do you get a class of people who are idle? Well, they effectively become a rentier class, coupon clippers, some sort, even if it's government aid. And really, in reality, that's only possible in the richest countries and ultimately has to depend on somebody doing work. Typically, the unreciprocated labor of the global poor. Now, the Puritans were aware that not all socially necessary labor was paid. And there needs to be justice for people who are doing it. So under the post-work ethic, the idea is that universal basic income would free people to engage in unpaid work and voluntary work unlike in the work ethic. But in fact, the Puritan work ethic actually recognizes the value of care and of voluntary work. Here's the key, though. The work ethic identifies work as disciplined activity that helps other people and society at large, okay? But it has to be disciplined. That is, it's not just whenever you feel like it, okay? Why? Because work has to be serving other people's needs, and other people's needs do not arise just when you feel like serving them, right? They arise on their own tempo for reasons independent of your own desires. The Puritans recognized that women, even if they were solely engaged in child rearing, were doing socially necessary labor and fulfilling the demands of the work ethic too, when they're raising children and tending to the sick and so forth in the context of the family. So pay has nothing to do with what real work is and the original work ethic. But more recently, people reflecting on care work that is unpaid, some have argued that that work ought to be paid. Maybe there should be wages for housework and paid parental leave, which we have in the social democracies. So what I want to stress here is that while social democracy wants to decommodify work in the sense that of removing absolute necessity to be on the paid wage labor market all the time, nevertheless, that's distinct from a basic income for surfers. And here, Richard Baxter, the leading theologian of the work ethic, is really a great read. I recommend if you're interested in delving into him. He's really a terrific writer and very morally insightful and a very shrewd business ethicist on top of it all. He wrote about 500 books. Imagine. Shocking. Yeah, he was really practicing the work ethic. Now, you imagine, though, if you have to deliver a 5-hour sermon every Sunday, you could really rack up the writing pretty fast. All right. Sanderson, getting back to Sanderson then, he's another wonderful work ethic theologian. He articulated an understanding of meaningful work. Okay, in an ad populum, he's trying to help us find our calling, the specialized occupation to which God has called us. Okay, and what I find interesting here is that Keynes was just taking for granted, as other post-work ethicists do, that work is intrinsically bad. It's only instrumentally valuable. Whereas the Puritans, actually, with the help of people like Sanderson, advanced what I consider an unsurpassed ideal of what intrinsically meaningful and fulfilling work would look like. And Sanderson is quite clear, and it's, I think, rather compelling if you can get it, okay? Here are the features. First of all, you gotta be doing honest work that advances the good of other people. That work has to fit your talents and your education. And you should find it fulfilling in that people like their own agency. They like exercising agency. They like exercising their skills and their talents. He urged people to find an occupation that would sustain their commitment because they enjoy exercising those talents in the service of other people. He also insisted that workers in all occupations are equally honorable and are entitled to respect as long as they're working in the right spirit. That is, in the spirit of care and love for our fellow human beings, the people we're directly serving. And, if you look at this, fitting your talents in education, fulfilling yourself and exercising those talents in a way that, sustains your passion. What is Sanderson doing here? He's basically invented in one sermon the core doctrines of career counseling. He's like the first modern career counselor, right? Now, if you take these demands seriously and you think society should be affording everyone meaningful work, that means we probably have to reconsider the way we're dividing tasks up and bundling them into jobs. We should make sure that people have access, effective access to meaningful work, not just mindless, boring drudgery that is disrespected and paid poorly. And indeed, these theologians insisted that workers are entitled to fair and living wages, safe working conditions, and working conditions where they're not tyrannized by a boss. I mean, they acknowledge that you needed bosses sometimes, but the bosses should treat their workers with respect and not just yell and scream at them and order them around imperiously. Whereas the post-work ethic really has given up on even the idea of reshaping work to make it meaningful. It's taking for granted that the work that so many millions of workers experience today is nothing but drudgery and would never change. So why not just release them from work altogether? Well, and that raises the question about what the good life consists in. Now, Keynes argued that the good life is found in our leisure moments, living in the moment, enjoying the pleasures of life in that very moment. And he criticized the Puritans for always postponing pleasure. And indeed, we can even see this in Richard Baxter, who wrote a book called The Saints' Everlasting Rest. So what he thought was, in this world, in this life, we had to be working like crazy to the end of our days. But the reward will come in the next life. We'll be saved. And then we'll have an everlasting vacation in heaven, in communion with God, and that will be our pleasure. But it's postponed to the next life. And that's what Keynes really hated, the idea of this postponement for so long. What social democracy did, it's a much more secular philosophy. And so it pulled the rewards of the next life into this life. Right? And so that's where you get paid vacation from, but it's still tied to the insistence that of high labor force participation rates, okay, in order to generate the tax revenues you need to support all the parental leave and so forth. So I read the social democratic work ethic as a secularized work ethic, right? Leisure's important, you get your guaranteed paid vacations, but the icing is not the whole cake, right? The work ethic now under social democracy is no longer an ascetic ideal. It values a purposeful life of promoting the good of other people. And well, why work within big organizations rather than just, volunteer work or, that you pick up here and there? Formal organizations have an important role in society. They basically scale up the scope of social cooperation and take advantage of a more sophisticated division of labor, which enhances productivity and enables people to serve others beyond their face-to-face relations with friends, family, and the local community. And critically here, what's important is, again, work is not just when you feel like it, right? Work has to be disciplined in order to achieve stuff meaningful. You have to be there in every job, even if it's the most exalted. Always has a bunch of stuff in it, tasks that you don't like to do. It's just built into it. There's nothing unfair about asking the exalted to sometimes do some tasks that they're not so keen on. And what I want to suggest here is that to get fulfillment from meaningful activity is not the same as experiencing pleasure in the moment. Nothing wrong with pleasure in the moment, but if that's all you're doing, you look back on your life and you ask, what have you achieved and is there any meaningful there? Endless parties, you're not going to remember, right? But you do remember raising your kids, having them grow up, be loving and responsible adults. That's something really to be proud of. As well as achievements at work. But remember, raising children itself is honorable labor. I want to argue also that universal basic income is no remedy for technological unemployment, as Andrew Yang and some of the other Silicon Valley tech executives imagine. In a way, they're kind of brushing off the fact that they anticipate displacing, basically eliminating most meaningful work from everyone's lives except for a tiny group of engineers who are creating code whose purpose is precisely to render most of us replaceable by AI and robots. What are the actual consequences of job loss? Well, there are empirical studies of this. Involuntary job loss leads to depression, a shrinking of social connections and loneliness, feelings of uselessness, sometimes so severe that indeed some of the studies suggest that job loss has a negative impact on people's psyches, equivalent to the death of a spouse. Think about that, it's pretty serious. If you look at prisons, one of the ways that prisons punish prisoners is by depriving them of their work duties. Prisoners want meaningful activity, even in prison, and punishment is depriving them of work, confining them to their cells. Even if there's a TV there, it's no substitute. In the United States, they've done studies of lottery winners, and even if they've hit the jackpot, most of them still want to work. They might quit the current job that they're in, get a better job, but they still basically still work for pay. And so I want you to reflect on what would a life beyond necessity, what would be a good life beyond necessity? Well, the movie WALL-E gives one possible vision, right? That a life of pure consumption, right? Like all of your needs are taken care of, and robots and AI are anticipating every need and just giving it to you. And you're just floating along on this floating chair and being entertained, right? And, I look at this and I think this is a dystopia. This is not my vision of a good life. We could still have people who are engaged in work even without any physical necessity for it. And, when I imagine what that utopia would look like, it's like Star Trek, right? These people are working, right? They're exploring new worlds. That's really exciting. It's adventurous. They're right, making new discoveries. Like, that's amazing. They have incredible talents. They're cooperating, right? This is really awesome. Now, they do play, but that's for the holodeck, right? Right here, they're not playing, even though none of the work they're doing is work by necessity because, when they need food, they just get, some machine that materializes a hamburger somehow, out of thin air. None of this is necessary work, but still they want to do it. They do it voluntarily. They create great relationships of collegiality in cooperating in journeys of discovery and adventure. I think that's a pretty cool vision of a fulfilling work life. Thank you.
Hello? Yes. We will now take audience questions. Holton here will run around with a microphone. If you could please raise your hand, and then you'll get the microphone and be talking to the microphone.
Thank you. I'm very, very sympathetic to what you're saying, but I imagine a Keynesian saying, no, what we need is a more complex, fulfilling notion of leisure, the people at the Wally station or whatever it was, that's not leisure because they're unfulfilled. Like it feels Keynes' notion of leisure might involve a notion of fulfillment in the same way that the puritanical notion of work involved fulfillment. So at that point, are we just saying the same thing, or is this a way of defending the kind of leisure path?
So I think Keynes, he had a strong sense of aesthetic pleasure, so he would enjoy art as a consumer. And he's involved in like book clubs and discussion clubs and things like that, which is like, it's cool. And I agree, it's like better than the Wall-E world, for sure. More uplifting activity. But what I want to stress is that at the end of the day, I think it's part of the good life to have made a difference for other people. You know what I mean? Like actually helping them. And that itself is meaningful. And I think an important component of the good life. And that, I think, is a vision that we get from these Puritans, and something I think we should continue with.
Sort of a follow-up on that. So, I mean, Keynes, as a perhaps unfortunate biographical matter, got a bunch of his value theory from Moore.
Yes.
And the Moore value theory is, so I think I'm kind of not on your side, Andrew, because the Moore value theory exactly seems to sort of be too aestheticized and passive. And it seems like kind of a shame that when Keynes was doing all this cool economics, he had the unfortunate Moore value theory going in there as well, because otherwise, I mean, you might get something that combines the good bit of Moore with the 20 hours of meaningful work or something.
What you say is really important, that Moore did have this very aestheticized version of understanding of the intrinsic value. Ironically, Keynes actually criticized Moore on that very account. It didn't mean, but I think this shows that Keynes himself hadn't quite solved the problem that, of the idle rich. Now, of course, the idle rich that, he was concerned about weren't engaged in such highly aesthetic activities. It was more like fox hunting and gambling and things like this. But still, the purely aesthetic life also has its limitations.
Thanks for the talk. So quick question about the unconditional basic income. Yeah, as I understand, one of the justifications for the policy, has to do with bolstering the bargaining power of workers, right? So, if you introduce a UBI, then employment has to compete against a worker who has a choice to choose the UBI, and as opposed to if there weren't a UBI, the worker has to just take the employment or, face starvation. So it increases the bargaining power. So it has this kind of effect of, I think what you're talking about, which is a kind of reform spirit, which it forces employers then to make the workplace more appealing and more attractive to workers. So what do you think about the UBI on, potential UBI on that front? Yeah.
From a bargaining power perspective, I'm actually more in favor of unions. And the reason for that is that I think there's a certain degree of additional agency you get from increasing your individual bargaining power. But there are things you can get from collective bargaining power that you can't get from individual bargaining power. And that has to do with actual voice in the workplace that can address various collective modes, the sort of collective infrastructure of work that can address things like the nature of the division of labor And why should, drudge tasks be concentrated into the lowest paid jobs? You can address these more collective issues through things like labor unions that really you can't do just by enhancing individual bargaining power.
Fascinating talk. The idea that struck me as interesting, though, is this question of that you traced this origin of this positive work ethic to the Puritans, and then trace that into social democracy. But there's a lurking question that I have about then how it relates with the general decline of all kind of Christian theology within society. Because in part, it's easy to see how the Puritans justify things because there is no drudgery if all work is noble. But under contemporary circumstances, if you don't believe in God, then you've eliminated the validation mechanism for drudgery, which makes work drudgery in the first place. If you're a McDonald's worker, but you are also a good Christian, then you could at least be vindicated and think, I am being a good Christian, I am being productive, I am doing right by my God, and thus your work at McDonald's is no longer drudgery. But under a strictly secular framework, I cannot see any order which ever justifies McDonald's work as anything other than drudgery. So, and this is, I think, going to become more prominent because right now, at least, we still have the ghost of Christianity within our society. We still have this lingering vestige, but as we push more and more towards total secularization, it begs the question, effectively, of what is the fate of things in a truly atheized society. So, your thoughts, Dr. Anderson?
Yeah, well, look, restaurant work can be perfectly meaningful. The way McDonald's has organized the division of labor is not so great, granted. But suppose every McDonald's franchise was a workers' collective. They would divide the labor differently. We actually have empirical evidence for this. Workers' cooperatives do redivide the labor and rotate positions generally so that you actually get to exercise a diverse mix of skills. Everybody does their share of drudge work, but they also do their share of more skilled work as well. So that's what I mean by refashioning work to make it more meaningful. And also, we should step back and just think about, like, why do franchise models, why are they, so successful? And from a purely capitalist point of view, and it could be that there are systems of regulations that favor that style rather than, say, the individual restaurant with their own personal vision of what it should be like that would promote, say, greater interest in regional foods and so forth. Like, we could imagine a different kind of ecosystem of eating out that would promote a much more diverse and interesting set of restaurants than, the fast food chains we have today. And I'm willing to bet, although I haven't empirically investigated this, that there are features of the, system of economic regulations that tend to favor franchising, but you could change those regulations and favor more meaningful restaurant work.
Here, I'll stand up, make it easier to see me. So I'm interested in this Star Trek vision because I'm one of the people who maybe a little, out of a little bit of fear, am worried that at least throughout my lifetime, work is going to dramatically be changed by AI and automation. I think, for me, that seems like a pretty clear path forward, but I guess there's room to disagree with that. But what I'm curious about is, it seems as though in the ultimate dystopia, as you called it, robot surgeons are so good that having a doctor in the surgery room is like negligent. Building homes with 3D printers is so fast and efficient that, community projects to build them for other people become negligent because these people are like without homes during that time. And actually doing good for people is robbed from us by the power of automated processes and intelligences. And so I guess my question is assuming that we reach a point where the tech billionaires say that we're going to be heading, and these things really do become as good and as powerful as they are, and they have as much possibility to do what we would consider conventional good through humans, is there a point by which we need to intervene and say, okay, even though these things could be doing this, we have to stop them so that we can have Star Trek? Or are we, like, at some extent kind of condemned for the sake of maximizing the amount of good done in the world? Some of us have to be in WALL-E.
Yeah, that's a great question. And there's this economist, Daron Acemoglu, who's been thinking about like the future of work with increasing AI and other technologies. And he thinks, and I agree with him, that the direction that these new technologies take in reshaping work, that's a social choice. And you know, it's critical that that choice be made democratically and not just monopolized by a handful of 100 billionaires in Silicon Valley, right? Because they have their own interests. Those interests are not the same as other people, as ordinary people. They've got their own visions, you know, heroic visions of the society they want to shape. But you know, they also don't really take an interest in our interests. We have our own interests. And I would add that I'm not at all convinced that the robots will be a perfect substitute for human beings and human connection. There's a lot missing, you know, if you are, say, okay, a robot nurse. Is it, and I'm imagining a nurse who's not the kind of harried nurse who's stressed out because they have 20 patients that they have to keep alive, like spinning 20 plates on those sticks, right? No, that is a degenerate form of nursing that's turned into drudgery. I'm talking about real nursing where you build a connection and a relationship with the patients under your care, where you listen to their concerns and address them and show that you care and hold people's hands when they're in distress. You're not going to get that from a robot. Not a genuine, you know, connection. You might simulate something like that, but the real thing, you know, will not be there. And what I'm looking forward to, say, in nursing, contrary to the trends right now, which is not quite robot, you know, substitution, but just increasing the pace and the patient load to make it unbearable so that you can just barely do what's physically necessary and not tend to the emotional needs to be cared for. Like, that's already a bad enough vision before we replace the nurses with robots. Right, and you know, we should be thinking about how to humanize these jobs and not how to automate them.
I'm thinking about something you said about how we sort of like bundle up various responsibilities and package them into jobs. And I'm thinking about how we sort of how the economy has been broken up in this way. And right now it seems obviously like, you know, like responsibilities are divvied up just sort of based on the market. I suppose an alternative way of doing that would be like a, you know, a totally state-planned economy. Obviously, both of these proposals have some pretty clear historical deficiencies. You also suggested that like one way to resolve some of these issues would be through like collective bargaining and union proliferation. But I'm thinking about responsibilities that generally don't like produce a lot of capital value. Or at least are not seen as being sort of financially valuable. Elder care, right, when it falls to like adult children, or child care when it, you know, disproportionately falls to like stay-at-home moms, or even working moms who are then expected to do additional labor. And I was wondering if you could say more about whose responsibility it might be to sort of like reconceptualize how we distribute labor and how we share and distribute like incentivization for various kinds of labor. I don't think that, like, state planning would solve all these problems. I don't think.
I agree completely.
And I think clearly the market also has not has not solved that problem, right? Vis-a-vis like the care economy. And I was wondering if you had sort of a more robust, positive vision for what could solve that.
Yeah, everyone should rush out and buy this book by Hillary Cottam called Radical Care. This is an unbelievably amazing book. She is a work designer and an innovator in the social care space in the UK. This is an absolutely transformative book. She has a very sharp critique of the British welfare state as it developed in the post-war era, for essentially applying a kind of industrialized vision onto the welfare state with a kind of assumption that everyone has like identical needs. And so you just sort of provide baseline social services on a kind of industrial model. And she argues that this is actually failing to keep up with the times and with things like the aging population and with contemporary issues. And she's actually worked, so her idea is, one of the first chapters is very powerful. She does a study of reform of a local council social services system for families in deep, deep, deep distress. So these are families where, like, you've got a single mom who's been unemployed, never been able to hold down a job, and the kids are, running wild and getting involved with, doing various criminal activities and getting involved, with the police and the criminal justice system, and, addiction and, right, it's just chaotic families. And she documented in this town that some of these families would get visits from like 80 different social service workers, from police, from social workers, from various psychiatrists, psychologists, like 80 different people. And she went around and asked them, so, what have you done to actually help these chaotic families? And they all give up, they say in despair, I've been working with them for years and nothing has changed. And she says, well, why don't we get together, these different people and have a conversation about what would be needed to actually help these people change. And her model is actually deeply philosophical, because she's moving away from this kind of utilitarian vision of just satisfying basic needs, like do they have enough food in the house, to the building of capabilities, that is the building of agency, so that people can actually get control over their lives. Because these are people who feel that their lives are not under their control, but they lack the agency, the skills to kind of get their acts together. And then she developed a system where different social service workers in the welfare system would hook up to members of the community who might be interested in volunteer work. Some of them retirees who are looking for something meaningful to do and have some energy. And these teams, which would be multidisciplinary, some from the community, some paid civil servants, from various agencies, get together, and then they don't just sort of provide services. What they do is they talk to the families in distress and ask them, what do they feel is missing? What are their aspirations? What would be a good life for them? And then they work from there to skill building. But it's very responsive, and it's already according the family members agency by asking them what they want rather than giving them what the state presumes that they want. And even for them, even giving them permission to dream and to say, we're going to help you fulfill your aspirations. And that might take, some helping them like get addiction services, but also contextualize the addiction services in terms of enhancing capabilities so that people feel something positive out on the end. right? That then they can actually achieve things that they couldn't when they're high. Right, and the experience of agency is transformative and powerful, but if you've never had that, never had experience of like conceiving of a plan and successfully execute it, a lot of these people really, they just never, they weren't, you know, for one reason or another, that was not part of their life experience growing up. And you can give it to them. Like, it's very creative work, it's meaningful, you see people build agency. She also proved that these teams also save the welfare state money. Why? It's more expensive up front because you have a lot of highly skilled people who are now thinking very creatively and pouring a lot of their energies into, you know, the families. But over time, if the families build agency themselves, then they no longer need these services, right? So over time, right, there's a savings to the welfare state. It's an incredible book. She's unbelievable, and she has kind of a very creative way of helping teams brainstorm and design and learn from experience and redesign. It's amazing. I mean, it's like a whole system. She shows in this book about 6 or 7 experiments and how they worked out on different things like elder care, like these families in distress and so forth, different social problems. And we have to be thinking hard about this because, you know, about 70 to 80% of all the jobs that exist now are service jobs. Okay. Only a small fraction is manufacturing. Now that's a place where the robots really have taken over. But that's not necessarily bad. Like there, I think, you know, because manufacturing, this repetitive motion, right? It's perfect for robots. It spares people a lot of injury. The reality is those jobs are always boring, drudgery, and cause a lot of injury. And it's good to offload most of that manufacturing labor onto the robots. That's like a good use of robots. Now we're into service economy, service and information economy. It's different, using different skills and frankly, more sophisticated skills. So we should be able to actually work that up into lots and lots of meaningful jobs.
Hi, thank you again for your talk. So in one of our classes, we read your original works on democratic egalitarianism versus luck egalitarianism. And I remember whenever we read those texts, we saw a major critique of luck egalitarianism was its paternalistic and more pitiful regard to providing social services essentially did not respect people. And when you mentioned that currently tech billionaires and their like political allies are proposing UBI as sort of a standard basis for people, do you think that it holds that similar lack of respect for people's potential desire to do fulfilling work and find ways of making work more fulfilling, but instead is just giving them a very standard set of other options, or like the option of not just working in general?
Well, yeah, I mean, look, what would people be doing in their utopia? Okay, they wouldn't have to work for sure because they'd have the UBI, but then they'd be spending every last hour scrolling on their phones, right? Right, because, right, the technology is designed to maximize attention spent on our screens. Is that a vision of a good life? I don't think so. I think it makes people kind of miserable. And then we're like endless doom scrolling because, like, well, there's nobody out there, you know, for the youth to play with because they're all scrolling on their phones. So we have a major collective action problem. And indeed, it's a very interesting thing because young people actually know that they're addicted to the phone. And when you poll them, and this has been done, you know, they ask young people, you know, why don't you just give up all this social media? And the main reason why is the fear of missing out, right? All their peers are on the phone, so they got to be there, right, doing their social media thing. But then if you ask them a second question, would you prefer it if social media just disappeared? And they say yes. They would rather not be trapped. I think it's time to maybe think hard about regulating this space. At least, you know, they're making small steps. So some schools, including actually my own junior high school, was actually featured in the New York Times for one of the first middle schools to ban cell phones in the schools with positive effects. And on my own campus, University of Michigan, a couple years ago, there was a gigantic hacking incident that forced U of M to shut down all of its IT, email, access to class schedules, everything in the first 3 days of school. And a friend of mine is in the School of Information, which is all doing tech stuff and AI, and I asked him, so how did the students feel when they didn't have access, when their phones and computers were all shut down for 3 days? And he said, oh yeah, like I asked my students. And remember, these are people who are training up to be like computer people, tech people. And he said, oh yeah, he's talking to them and they said, wow, like I actually had to like get off my phone and talk to my roommate. And it was interesting. I kind of liked it. Yeah, we could all do with less phone, without less social media.
Question, if that's all right. So I have a lot of sympathy with this idea of the post-work ethic, and I love it, and I wish, if only my boss got on board, right? And what I'm thinking of is, like, when it comes to implementing things like this, there's so many factors affecting how work is shaped and how labor is divided, whether it's unions, campaign contributions, government regulations, finance, and helicopter parenting, college admissions. Like, there's so many things that are contributing to the way our system is currently working that it feels a little overwhelming. And I'm wondering if you have any views on what maybe like the first places to push for kind of reform, because it takes a kind of surgical precision, unlike, say, I don't know, firing hundreds of thousands of people overnight.
Oh, look, it is frankly inhumane to fire hundreds of thousands of people overnight, right? I mean, that is sort of the tech thing, right? And then, you break it, and that's the way for seeing, how to rebuild it. Well, when you break systems, you're breaking people along with that. It's not socially responsible. Look, we can experiment. Experimentation is fine, but what tends to be valorized in the tech world isn't responsible experimentation. It's, move fast and break things, heedless of the consequences for other people. And I think that's just wrong. You can get innovation without breaking people.
I'm curious if, and this is a follow-up on a question from over here around who is sort of the arbiter of how we move forward. But I'm curious about who determines what is meaningful. Is it the worker themselves that's determining what is meaningful? Is it us as a society determining it? And if one versus the other, I can see those coming into conflict with each other. And I'm thinking about something like the landlord, right? Okay, so the landlord thinks they're doing meaningful work, they're providing housing, but at the same time they're being extractive, perhaps, of, or even exploitative of the person that they're housing. So thinking about that, and then who determines where that line is for meaningfulness, perhaps the factory worker. I'm not making an argument that factory work is always fulfilling, but perhaps there's something fulfilling to someone. How do we reconcile that?
Look, there are responsible landlords who do a real good job. And look, landlords provide really important service, and there's a ton of maintenance that has to happen in apartments. And, people need stuff fixed in their apartments, and they need housing. I don't consider, landlords that occupation is inherently exploitative. It depends on the background rules whether it is exploitative or not. I mean, we have a lot of rules that encourage exploitation, in particular zoning rules that prevent the construction of sufficient housing, and that also is a major cause of homelessness. But you can rewrite the rules so that it doesn't afford opportunities, just for pure extraction. Provisional housing is a meaningful thing. Keeping those houses well maintained is meaningful, helpful work for people.
So like in regards to like the bargaining power of workers, what do you think about like a federal jobs guarantee as opposed to a UBI? Because I feel like it solves like most of the objections to UBI.
Yeah, federal job guarantee. The difficulty is to stop the jobs from turning into make work. It's actually quite difficult to ask the state to come up with jobs. It's not necessarily the best agent. So in fact, it's very interesting because the Puritans actually tried this. So in the 17th century, England did a very innovative thing. They did a survey of all of the poor. Not everyone, but just the poor. And they were trying to figure out, like, why do these destitute people exist? I mean, like, why is this happening? And they originally, the background Puritan theory was, well, you just got these lazy people on the one hand, and then you have the disabled on the other, like the people who are incapable of working, or they might not be disabled, but just like tiny children who aren't able to work yet, right? And that was the idea. You'd have the deserving poor, the people who are unable to work, and then the lazy poor who are, like grifters or something. And then when they actually did an empirical survey, they discovered this third class of very poor people, the involuntarily unemployed. They were shocked. and they thought, this is a disaster. It's a moral disaster because society is not providing enough paid work for people. And so what they did is they tried to, like they would set up in the homes of the very poor some weaving looms and provide them with wool and stuff to make cloth. And all of these things failed. Why? Because they couldn't cover the cost, basically, of provision. And so, like, the system collapsed, and the Puritans never really could come to terms with involuntary unemployment because, in a way, they didn't really have the economic knowledge. These days, it's not that hard to solve involuntary unemployment. It's a lot of it just has to do with keeping up the central banks, right? They play a critical role in maintaining full employment. There's also structural unemployment, which is somewhat different and less tractable. And we do have to work on policies that enable that provide for equitable growth in geographic terms. So one of the great injustices of American society today is that the concentration of upwardly mobile jobs in a tiny number of major metros that are essentially unaffordable if you don't already own property. That's outrageously unjust, and what it's done is it's actually frozen people in place. There's way less class mobility than there was, in the post-war era, and a lot of it has to do with the impossibility of moving. So your factory closes in a factory town in, rural Kentucky or whatever, and you can't sell your house because there's no market value, and even if you could sell it, it's so low, it wouldn't enable you to move to the places where there's job growth anyways, because you couldn't find housing there for the price you got for your home. People are stuck in place, and that's a serious problem. There's tons and tons of geographical injustice like that, and our system has kind of fallen asleep at the wheel, and we've been concentrating opportunities in a tiny number of places, and it's bad. We should be working on the geographic dispersal of opportunity across, small towns, small cities, rural areas, right? We haven't thought that through.
Hi, Dr. Anderson. Thank you so much for coming out to speak to us. My name is Dulce, and I had a question about, I know you mentioned we have a problem as a society on taking collective action, and usually when we do take collective action, we're about to fall. And I wanted to speak about, like, for example, climate change. That is something that's going to affect all of us, and it's already affecting all of us. Do you think the transition of utilizing media, because we've advanced so much, we shouldn't, in media, I mean, it has affected a lot of us negatively, but what do you think about shifting into a more meaningful way, like you were saying, for example, using media, film as a way to make education accessible and also communicate the realities of different people, since we are a very diverse, we're so diverse as a world, as a people, and what do you think about that that expansion as like a solution to us coming together to work towards making the human condition and just society better, utilizing our media, utilizing our technology rather than, because I mean AI is also taking jobs and that's negative, but I also think that media could be utilized in a positive way. And what do you think it will take for us as a collective to shift into working towards making education accessible? Because it's just shown, if you have access to education, you're more curious, you're more likely to be able to find your own path and contribute in your own way, plug yourself in where you're needed, because that we all should contribute, like the Puritan thought of everyone that is able-bodied should contribute and help those that are not. But yeah, that's my question. Thank you.
Yeah, so look, I'm not against technology. What I want us to think about is how to shape it in ways that's going to actually serve people rather than just serve, a handful of tech billionaires. And there are some positive uses of AI. And some of the studies show that in certain applications of AI actually enhance the skills of middle-level workers and enable them to get better wages, as well as improving their productivity and the experience of their work. So there are positive applications of AI. If you assign AI some of the drudge work, well, that's fine, and that's a good use of AI. But if you assign AI like all of the creative work, and you're just sort of tending to it, right? That isn't a good use of AI. And then the question is, well, who's going to control the development of AI? And here, we haven't assigned that job to the right people, okay? But if you look at, say, Taiwan, Taiwan actually has a ministry of AI that has done some very creative work on enhancing democracy and using social media as a way to enhance democratic deliberation. In order to do that, you need the algorithms not to amplify the toxic, hateful, divisive, and misinformation. And they've been thinking really hard about how to design social media so that it's pro-social rather than dividing people and making them hate each other and believe all kinds of lies. There are ways to do that, okay? But it's not what's happening in America. But you look in Taiwan, they've done creative things. You can contrast, for instance, how the algorithms were working in Taiwan as opposed to the United States during the pandemic. Here, people were getting all kinds of quack medicine and encouraged to not vaccinate and so forth, and being given conspiracy theories of various sort that made polarized society and made people distrust each other. In Taiwan, they had a much healthier set of algorithms that were encouraging people, like at the beginning of the pandemic, to report on where can you find sources of masks at decent prices, and it would show up on your screen, maps and so forth, where you could find stuff, and what would be helpful, like actual pro-social, algorithms. There are ways to design this. It's well beyond my technical abilities to tell you how this is working, but it was quite successful and actually brought Taiwanese society together, the social media, whereas here it was all, divided us.
We have time for one more question.
Hi, Dr. Anderson. So as you've been speaking, I've like had the Fiverr consultant commercial in my head. Part
The
of the time,
what word?
There's a company called Fiverr where it's supposed to connect people who are out there to be hustlers and entrepreneurs for themselves with companies who are just looking for them. So I've sort of been thinking about this, you know, on the one hand, we've sort of been like sold a bag of goods, or some of us anyways, that, you know, the hustler, consultant, influencer life could be a meaningful life where workers have control over the work that they do and who they choose to do it with and when they choose to work. But on the other hand, it feels very deceptive because it also means that employers are off the hook of having to provide any sort of safety net to workers. And so I'm curious how we think about this going forward based on your thoughts.
Well, that's really great. And I just want to make a couple points about the whole influencer system. One is that it's tournament style competition. So there are other things like this, like publishing fiction, right? A handful of stars get essentially all the money from publishing novels, and same for like pop music. It's exactly the same. The economy has been designed in such a way to very richly award a very tiny handful of superstars, and everybody else, you know, toils away in obscurity. So the distribution of like income from these kinds of systems is pretty negative. And it wasn't always like that. I mean, you know, in the 70s, I remember the family would drive from Connecticut, where I was growing up, down to Florida, where my grandparents had retired. And, you know, all along, if you turn on AM radio, you get all the local color in the radio stations, like tons of variety, and you really get a rich sense of how diverse and creative the American music scene was in those days, and how many people actually got access, you know. It was quite rich, but there was a change in the regulatory system that enabled the massive consolidation of radio ownership into a few gigantic systems. And that's what created the tournament style, where you promote these superstars, and everybody else just becomes obscure. It's not great. I don't think it's great for our cultural development to homogenize, you know, get, you know, homogenized versions of every genre of music. We can design things differently, you know, is the point here. And a lot of it just has to do with the rules of the game. And so these influencers, right, a tiny number win out. But then even for them, it becomes a treadmill. Because in order to stay on top from the algorithms, you have to constantly produce content. And once you slip off that treadmill, like it's very hard to recover. And so people find themselves forced to produce content even if they don't have much to say. And yeah, at some point they realize, wow, they're kind of imprisoned by the system. But you're quite right that there are still some advantages to gig work, and a lot of it has to do with control over your hours and the fact that you can do it at home, you don't have to commute to an office, that you don't have a boss. Like, these are all great things. And there are some creative people who've been thinking about how to actually make gig work to make sure that people like have a safety net, and, you know, and, you know, there are ways too to redesign our understanding of employment so that they can get access to, you know, to some of the benefits of paid employment, even though they're self-employed. And there are people working on that. Again, all of this has to do with systems design, and we can do a better job by, you know, we need creative people to rethink systems, because a lot of our systems now were based on, you know, the older mass industrialized manufacturing model, but that's not our current society. It's not our current economy.
One last question.
Thank you, Dr. Anderson. And thank you, everybody. I mean, this is, I think my parents would be very, specifically my father, would be pleased with the questions and the evolution of this series. It does seem to me that fundamentally, everybody needs more education. And your lecture today offered, you know, some insights by bringing us back through history and understanding, a better understanding of why we have the issues that we have today. But every solution that's going to take place that we're talking about here is going to require, I hope, some informed people, right? Some really informed people, maybe. And the one thing that was not mentioned, my father, one of the things he did was he started with the, we lived in Cambridge, England, and I was, you know, they threw me in a boys' school, but my dad studied with Watson, the people that discovered, you know, worked on DNA, or at least were credited with it. We all know that actually it's a woman from Long Island. But what concerns me really fundamentally, and I have children, and I concern me every day, is that we know a lot more about what it is to be human today. And if you don't embrace some science in this discussion as well, in terms of what each of us is actually interested in, you know, it just strikes me that one of the elements that's not in this narrative is that we need to know more about who we are and what we want, and we can have some insights through that with science in this conversation as well. So that's it. Thank you.
Yeah, I would wholeheartedly endorse that.